Thanks for tuning in again for another share on tourism. In the last share, we discovered that the word tourist and tourism, although related, are both looked at in a different context. We also look at the types of tourism and tourist. A list of the general reasons why persons visit places as a tourist we also noted. In today's share I will focus explicitly why tourist is important to the Caribbean region as well as the problems associated with the tourism sector. Tourism is considered one of the main economic driver of the Caribbean economy. As a result of tourism, many countries throughout the Caribbean enjoy growth in local employment. Increased tourism leads to increased employment. From resorts and hotels to restaurants, clubs, bars, diving schools and other adventure activities, Caribbean countries thrive on the jobs tourists create. Even people you wouldn't normally think work in tourism, do, right down to the fishermen and farmers who provide food for cafes, restaurants, and hotels. Jamaica alone hires thousands of people who work either directly or indirectly in the tourism industry, which is the second largest employer in the country. Increasing jobs also increases tax revenue, which can go into services and facilities for the local people. Everything from infrastructure to health services, which accommodates health tourism travelers, needs to improve in order to cater to the tourists who come for these reasons. This benefit then passes down to the local population. Ironically, tourism aid in the publicizing of the problems and struggles of people living in the Caribbean are often hidden behind the luxurious resorts. When people travel to the Caribbean islands, they typically don't get to see the local side of the country unless they choose to, perhaps through a volunteer opportunity. Issues that are important in this region of the world, even if they are purely environmental, can be brought to light because of tourism. When people travel here, they hopefully become educated about their destination. When they return back to the United States, they are then able to raise awareness about issues in the Caribbean, which is crucial for any developing countries. Interestingly, the Caribbean, as beautiful as it is, has fallen victim to unfortunate tragedies over the years, whether it was the earthquake that hit Haiti or Hurricane Maria which devastated Puerto Rico. When these things happen, tourism numbers drop dramatically, and it's a huge financial loss for these countries who need the tourism money more than ever to help rebuild. So while it may seem insensitive to travel to a Caribbean country after such a tragedy, it can actually be beneficial. That being said, travelers should check travel advisories for certain countries before traveling there. The U.S. State Department website can provide information on travel advisories and restrictions, if applicable, for the countries or islands you plan on traveling to. Although tourism certainly seems to have more advantages in the Caribbean than disadvantages, there are ways in which it can hurt the locals. For instance, in Cuba, sex tourism creates difficult social problems, while water activities and the construction of fancy resorts are hurting wildlife and polluting the water. Before traveling to the Caribbean, tourists should do their best to educate themselves on local issues and see what they can do to help. The environmental threats created by tourism in the Caribbean have been the subject of considerable attention. Tourism often brings large groups of people to destinations, and the supporting infrastructure they require, create a variety of threats for the environment. Tourists generate substantial amounts of solid waste. Tourists in the Caribbean have been estimated to generate twice as much solid waste per capita as local residents. In addition, tourists also generate substantial amounts of liquid waste, much of which goes untreated. According to some estimates, as much as 75% of wastewater treatment plants operated by hotels and resorts, so-called package plants, in the Caribbean did not comply with basic effluent discharge criteria in 1996. Tourist facilities are often built in environmentally sensitive areas. In the Caribbean, the majority of tourism facilities are located within 800 meters of the high water mark, and most tourist activity takes place in the area between the back bays and fronting reefs. Interestingly, we should note that tourists place high demand on energy and freshwater resources. Tourists typically use much higher amounts of both energy and fresh water than local residents. The simple presence of tourists can have adverse environmental impacts in some particularly sensitive ecological systems. In the Caribbean, A common example is the impact on coral reefs from various recreational users. In some locations, health and environmental health issues may be important, particularly those related to waterborne and sexually transmitted diseases. Induced settlement is a typical problem faced by several local communities throughout the Caribbean. You see, tourist areas often attract large numbers of settlers. Housing and support infrastructure for this induced settlement is often inadequate, leading to substantial problems of solid and liquid waste disposal. The demand for goods and services by tourists strongly influence the cost of living for locals living within tourist districts. To the extent that the tourist sector acquires a variety of goods and services within the country, additional impacts may also be induced depending on how these goods and services are produced. The concept of ecological footprint, the wider impact of an individual or industry via direct and indirect effects, may be a useful way to assess the broader impacts of tourism. The fundamental environmental resources used in Caribbean tourism are relatively basic, the so-called three Cs of sun, sand, and sea. To these might be added landscape, although that is itself often composed of combinations of sun, sand, and sea, and supporting resources such as water. In particular cases, additional environmental resources play a role, such as coral reefs or forests. Leaving aside the sun resource, which is not subject to depletion, the good news is that sand and sea are relatively resilient resources, and that damage to them can often be repaired, although doing so can often be costly, sometimes very costly. Beach and sea throughout the Caribbean are being threatened. The main threats to these resources are similar: congestion, pollution, and erosion, in the case of the beaches. It should be noted that among these problems, congestion is the only one likely to result almost solely from tourism itself. Pollution and erosion can both result from non-tourism sources as well as tourism sources. Caribbean coastlines are now being flooded. This is partly due to the increase in the destruction of the region's, coral reef. In some locations, in addition to the important local benefits from coral reefs, for example as a habitat for fish and shellfish, coral reefs may also be an important part of the resources used by the tourist sector, both through direct use, such as diving, and because of the protection reefs can provide from storms. Fresh fish are enjoyed by residents and visitors alike. Overuse and inappropriate use can severely damage reefs and impair these benefits. Several natural habitats are being destroyed. This is being done in an effort to increase tourist accommodations along our coastline. In many areas, an attractive landscape is an important part of a destination's appeal. What makes for an attractive landscape is subjective and difficult to define, and moreover are subject to changing fashions, making this a particularly difficult resource to manage. Overbuilding in a previously pristine area, fostering pollution and in some cases influencing natural disasters, example flooding and coastal erosion. We will continue our discussion re tourism during the next presentation.